Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this very timely panel today. My name is Lina Khatib. I'm the director of the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House, and we are a strategic partner of the Doha Forum and have put together this panel today, and I'm sure the turnout in the room just emphasizes how important this issue is for all of us here. The panel, as you know, is about the geopolitical impact of the Russian aggression against Ukraine on the Middle East. I am joined by an illustrious panel today who I'm sure is known to most of you, but I'll introduce him very briefly before we start. Immediately to my right is Dr. Ibrahim Kalin, who's the spokesperson and senior advisor to the President of the Republic of Turkey. Next to him is Congresswoman Jane Harman, Distinguished Fellow and President Emerita at the Wilson Center in the US. Then we have Dr. John Gong, who's Professor of Economics at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. Last but not least, on our panel here is Dr. Majid Al-Ansari, who's the spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Qatar. And just in time, we welcome His Excellency Mr. Mohammad Hassan Sheikh al-Islami, who is the Deputy Foreign Minister of Iran and President of the Institute for Political and International Studies. Thank you all for joining us. Obviously, the panel is only 50 minutes, and we have a lot to talk about. So I will try to keep the answers, the questions to the point, and please keep your answers also short and to the point. I'm going to start with Congresswoman Harman, if that is okay, because obviously one of the key issues that is looming right now is the issue of increased oil production by Gulf countries, especially Saudi Arabia and UAE, that came as a request from the United States, however, was not necessarily met with a very positive response by those countries in the Gulf. And it became clear, at least to an observer like myself, that part of the issue here is the elephant in the room, which is Iran's regional role. So in a way, we have these two Gulf countries in particular kind of showing us that perhaps the road towards cooperation on Ukraine passes through Iran. So I wondered what your take is.
Well, good morning, everyone, and I'm sure His Excellency will also answer this question because it directly is about his country. But I would like to say first that Chatham House is a marvelous think tank, and Chatham House rules are now universal, and to commend what you do to everyone. I'm also wearing my Ukrainian solidarity colors, and hope that all of us are thinking about how to bring a quick end to the conflict there. On the question of energy, my impression from talking to the oil and gas minister here is that certainly Qatar is trying to do what it can to meet this request. The problem is that all of the supplies, this is what we were told yesterday, I'm leading a small delegation of women foreign policy experts from the United States. We were told that the amount of oil and gas that Qatar has is fully committed, and some of it is headed to Europe, and some of it to the West, and some of it elsewhere. They would obviously, if they had additional supplies, repurpose those toward Europe, but there is a big problem in Europe, which is Europe's ability to have infrastructure to distribute the oil and gas. Poland and Spain have excellent infrastructure, but the middle of Europe doesn't, including Germany. There are LNG terminals being built, but the capacity is not there and won't be there for a couple of years. President Biden said yesterday, as part of his speech, that there is now a commitment between Europe and the U.S. to reduce dependence on Russian oil and gas, but I did not see a deadline for that or the specifics for that. So I really cannot answer on behalf of Iran, and I assume that my colleague here will have the rest of the answer.
Absolutely. If I may just press you on this, my kind of entry point to this issue is, for example, Saudi Arabia looks at the US as not helping it enough, perhaps, on Yemen. Meanwhile, we've seen Houthi missiles launched from Hodeidah on Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is basically saying, you're asking us to increase oil production, but we've also asked you to help us more with our defense capacity vis-a-vis Iran. So the issue of Iran's regional role is something that perhaps UAE and Saudi Arabia in particular regard as being an issue that the US has sidestepped. So, you know, that is the US perspective that I'm asking you to comment on.
All right. Well, I think many of us from the US thought that the decision to pull out of the JCPOA was the wrong decision. And longer and stronger should have been, in my view, the approach to the JCPOA. I think it needed to be longer and stronger, and I still think that. I think that the U.S. is with Iran negotiating right now to go back to that agreement or some variation of that agreement, and I think it is a good thing for there to be the right agreement between Iran and the United States, and hopefully that will happen soon. You are right that there are other agendas in the Middle East. It's the Middle East. Oh, there are always other agendas in the Middle East, and there are some issues between Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the U.S. at the moment. But I would hope that everybody would understand that stopping the aggression in Ukraine is a high priority, and then moving forward, in my view, to a better world order that involves and consults with the Middle East, Africa, and other parts of the world on how we can coexist in a, not only a more friendly way, but a way that respects values like human rights and democracy is, I think, the big challenge. So we have to operate on several planes. The first immediate threat, at least as I think my government sees it, and I don't work for my government, is Ukraine-Russia. But the other plane that we have to address right now is what is our strategy going forward for leadership and for promoting human rights and democratic values.
Thank you. If I may move to Dr. Al-Ansari, since we're speaking about UAE and Saudi Arabia's relationship with the United States, we're seeing a bit of a different configuration with Qatar's relations with the United States in light of the conflict in Ukraine. What I'm seeing is increased strategic alliance between the two countries. And here I just want to ask, how is Qatar negotiating on the one hand, this increased strategic alliance with the United States, and on the other hand, the kind of bit of a divergent path that it has taken compared with that of UAE and Saudi Arabia, because obviously Qatar is now navigating its way out of the Gulf crisis as well. So how is Qatar balancing these two sets of relationships?
Thank you for that question. First of all, I'd like to say that when it comes to the Qatari position towards what's happening in Ukraine, I think the position has been crystal clear from the get-go. Our position is that we are against this military escalation in Ukraine by all means. Qatar is a country that has suffered a lot of challenges in the past when it comes to the big brother syndrome in international relations, when it comes to the protection of its own sovereignty and making sure that whether it is a small, middle, or a large power, we are all in international law, we are all equal, and we all enjoy the same rights. And therefore, when it comes to the Ukraine, our position has been said by many statements, including the statements by His Highness in his calls with President Zelensky, or the foreign minister with his counterpart, or even in Moscow, when our foreign minister, the deputy prime minister and foreign minister, Sheikh Hamid Abdirrahman, when he went to Moscow, he made it very clear from Moscow that Qatar stands against military escalation in Ukraine. There might be a question of, okay, so what is Qatar going to do? Is it going to be completely in the Western cap in this issue? Is it going to take another side? Is it going to be neutral? I think the Qatari position on this is that while we value our relationship with the West highly, and we consider ourselves to be in line with the the international consensus over condemning the military escalation in Ukraine. We believe in dialogue and in the importance that both parties get into dialogue as soon as possible. And we are willing to help facilitate such dialogue in any way possible. And this is why our foreign minister toured Europe and went to Turkey and talked to the UK and the US counterparts many times, along with countless calls with the Ukrainian sides that culminated at the end with a visit to Moscow to convey, first of all, the humanitarian needs of the Ukrainian side to the Russian side, and to make sure that these humanitarian needs are met, and also to see how we can advance a peaceful resolution to this conflict through dialogue and mediation. And messages were sent back and forth, and I know that after that visit, Qatar has conveyed the Russian replies to the European counterparts and to the Ukrainian side, and we are still maintaining that communication. As we heard President Zelensky yesterday, the role of Qatar is a continuing role. We believe as a small state that it is in our national interest as a country to make sure that these kind of conflicts are not prolonged and do not go beyond their contextual surroundings. Because small and middle countries and middle powers are always the victims of any polarized international scene. And as we have seen after the Second World War and during the Cold War, the non-aligned movement was a way forward for a lot of countries that are as small and middle power, a way out of the struggle between the two main powers at the time. It is still our duty as small and middle powers to facilitate. We are not within the polarized tensions, and therefore we have the agility, we have the experience, and we have the ability to go around, talk to everybody, get messages from all sides. And this is why I think Qatar is successful, because it maintained communication with all parties and maintains communication with all parties. Like the successes we had in Darfur and in other places, like with the effort that's happening with the JCPOA, I think our effort in Ukraine is not the only effort, but it's amongst the efforts done by our European counterparts and other international players. Regarding the position of the UAE and Saudi Arabia, I think every country has its own national interest to look for. You have to remember Qatar's main export is LNG. Qatar is not an OPEC member. Our neighbors are certainly OPEC members, and their main export is oil, so that is part of the changing dynamic. And also the relationship with the administration in the US. Not all GCC countries have the same rapport now with Washington, and I think that also has an effect, but of course I cannot answer for the UAE and Saudi Arabia.
Thank you so much. I do want to talk more about mediation, but first let's turn to Iran. Mr. Sheikh al-Islami, Congresswoman Harman did kind of say, let's hear from you about the Iranian position on the issue of the regional role and other things, and that's exactly what I want to ask you about. So as you know, Secretary Blinken is meeting with some Arab leaders in Israel, and one of the issues that is likely to come up is regarding the JCPOA and its link with Iran's regional role. Because once again, from what I can see, the resistance to the JCPOA amongst some countries in the Arab world, mainly countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE, is really to do with Iran's regional role. So when the Houthis launch missiles from Hodeidah on Saudi Arabia, this is hardly going to make them warm to the idea of sanctions being lifted on Iran. So the question here, will Iran ever really compromise on its regional role? Is Iran willing to kind of extend a bit of an olive branch regarding its regional role in Yemen, in Syria, so that these other issues can also be resolved? Because I personally think separating the JCPOA from Iran's regional role may have been done for policy sequencing purposes, but the reality is Iran is Iran. It's one country, and all the issues are interconnected, and the region is one region, with Iran being there geographically, forming potentially a risk to countries like UAE and Saudi and others, and we are seeing that through the Houthi activity, for example. So what's Iran willing to kind of give, so that this situation is de-escalated, so that perhaps we can move really beyond just talking about the JCPOA and sanctions? I know this morning, when we were hearing His Excellency Kharazi talk, the issue of the IRGC came up. And again, you can see the region is full of mistrust, around Iran, meaning the Arab region around Iran. So what's Iran willing to do about all this?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much for your question. In fact, I believe that it is not very constructive and very positive to talk about the crises which are existed in our region without considering the historical background and without considering a comprehensive approach towards these crises. I'm not here to talk about the roots, historical background of all crises in our region, but I would like to emphasize that in order to have a very comprehensive solution, in order to have a very constructive approach towards the architecture of regional security in our region, it is necessary to take an approach of very, comprehensive and context-oriented, let's say. You know that Iran has started negotiations with its neighboring countries during the recent administration time. The foreign policy of the Islamic Republic of Iran during the new administration is quite pragmatic. But let me once again emphasize that if we are talking about international law, principles, United Nations charters, this and that, with regard to Ukraine crisis, it is quite necessary to consider this kind of, rules and regulations with regard to the crises in our region. We have to consider these rules and international law. Iran is going to promote and betterment its relationship with its southern neighboring countries. We have started very constructive negotiations with Qatar, which is quite constructive. We have started the negotiations with United Arab Emirates, which has been quite progressive. We have had 4 rounds of negotiations with the Saudi Arabia, and we felt that we are moving forward. You know that we were supposed to have the 5th round of negotiations with Saudis in Baghdad last week. Unfortunately, because of these new developments in Saudi Arabia, which is not acceptable at all for us, and I think it is against law, it is against international law. The 5th round of negotiations has been postponed, but still we are trying to have it and to make the window open, to reserve it open. So without any doubt, there is a real will in Iranian government and system to make the difficulties and differences with the Arabic countries of the Persian Gulf managed in this way or other way. I would not like to be very optimistic. It is a very difficult mission, but we are doing our best, and we have received responses from our brothers in these Arabic countries many of these responses also are quite positive. Let me just add that I believe that this crisis in Ukraine can have a negative effect in the security structure in our region because of different reasons. I don't have time right now. If you wish, I can explain why. At least 4 or 5 reasons exist that make us be very cautious about the impact of Ukrainian crisis on the Middle East security situation. But let me wrap up with this, that considering the historical, cultural, political differences between Iran and its neighboring countries, and considering the Ukrainian situation, we believe that we have to be even more active in our endeavors in order to come to a kind of security arrangement or agreement in the Persian Gulf. We are supporting that, we are for that, and we will do our best in order to convince all neighboring countries to cooperate in this plan. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, if there is one positive thing in this whole very awful state that we're discussing, is perhaps increasing urgency to resolve issues. That would be a positive outcome. On that note, I want to turn to Dr. Kalin. Yesterday we were hearing that Turkey is offering to mediate. We also have confirmation that Qatar is willing to mediate. Let's just focus on Turkey. If Turkey is going to mediate between Russia and Ukraine, what does this mean for Turkey's interests in places like Syria and Libya, where Russia is also a stakeholder, and what leverage does Turkey have, considering that in these contexts it has been really standing on the opposite side to Russia in many ways?
Thank you, Lina. Good morning to everyone, and thanks for organizing this wonderful panel. I want to thank the Chatham House and Doha Forum for inviting us to talk about this important issue. Now, before I turn to Turkey's mediation efforts, let me just say one word about the state of affairs in regards to the Ukrainian war right now. I'll just mention very briefly that once this is all over, and of course we are all trying to make this war come to an end sooner rather than later, there will have to be a new security architecture to emerge globally. How that security architecture will be shaped, structured, will actually shape the course of events in the decades to come. Every step that we take, every move that we make in regards to bringing into this war at this point is going to have an impact on how that security architecture will be shaped. Russia is not going to go away. As a country, Russia is going to be there. Western Bloc is going to be there. Ukraine will remain an independent, sovereign country with its own territorial integrity, and we all support and make sure that this is the case. But mediation efforts, other efforts to bring an end to this war will be key in terms of shaping that new security architecture. Therefore, we have to be very careful with every step that we are taking right now, as we speak, today, tomorrow, in the months to come. Number two, what led to this crisis and war needs to be studied carefully. The power disequilibrium that has shaped the international order ever since the end of the Cold War, actually, over the last 3 decades, has everything to do with the rise of this crisis and, unfortunately, the eventual war that we are all trying to stop right now. So we have to think about that too. That is how we are going to address the issue of power disequilibrium, create an environment in which every key player, from Russia to Iran, from the US to European countries, from Turkey to Gulf countries, feel safe enough and secure enough in the international order that nobody actually resorts to any kind of disruptive action that will destroy the international political order, that will upset the financial markets and the rest. Number three, you talked about energy and related issues. Of course, this will be, I think, key, again, in the decades to come. The energy geopolitics will have to change after this war. How that's going to be shaped, again, I don't think in the long run it's going to be enough. I don't think it's going to be enough to increase oil production or gas production. That's not going to solve the problem. We will face this price increase in energy prices, commodity prices, logistic prices, and everything else, especially given the impact of a pandemic and everything. We have to think in some other ways to address this issue as the global community. I want to bring in an important principle that from our part of the world that Imam al-Ghazali stated almost 1,000 years ago. He's an important Muslim scholar who lived in the 12th century. He said that as a principle, that which exceeds its limits turns into its opposite. That which exceeds its limits turns into its opposite. You can apply this to politics, you can apply this to social networks, you can apply it to anything. The reason I mention this is that the efforts that we are making to bring an end to this war right now need to be devised, thought through very carefully so that we don't destroy or end up destroying what we're trying to build up after this war. So coming to our mediation efforts, it is with this approach that we have kept our lines of communication open with both Russia and Ukraine. We have comprehensive, good relationship with both countries. You're right, there are a number of areas in which we, in fact, disagree with Russia, like in Syria, like in Libya, and other places. But I think it's also important to note that we have been able to develop a working relationship with Russia where we manage those differences in a way that helps the processes on the ground. In Syria, we are probably the only counterbalancing force against the regime supported by the Russian forces there. A point to keep in mind is the situation in Idlib, where you have about 3 million people squeezed in that little part of Syria, and we are keeping, in fact, we are preventing, Turkey is preventing the next wave of refugee crisis coming out of Syria. And I think we all, especially our Western partners, should be thankful to Turkey and Turkey's military presence in northern Syria, because that's the only thing that is really keeping these people stay in Idlib, Afrin, and other places. Otherwise, Russia and the regime can easily put pressure on these people, try to move them towards north, which will be Turkey, because they cannot go south. That's the regime-controlled areas. They cannot go west. That's the sea controlled by Russia and the regime. The only way they can go is up north, and that will be Turkey. And we cannot, of course, take any more refugees, more than what we have. We already have almost 4 million refugees from Syria. So actually we are keeping the situation very quiet and calm in Syria. I think that should be appreciated. The reason I say this is that sometimes we get very unfair treatment from our Western allies because of our military presence in northern Syria. We are still facing sanctions by some of our allies because of our military operations into northern Syria. But it's helping everybody. We are also providing a counterbalancing act in Libya, in Karabakh, in southern Caucasus, and other places. Moving forward, we want to keep our lines of communication open with both Russia and China. President Erdogan has good relationship with both presidents, and leadership diplomacy will be key, I think, in bringing an end to this war. Of course, all other measures are welcome. We understand, we support, and that of course, the Ukrainians need to be supported by every means possible so that they can defend themselves, so that we all support and defend Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. But we also have to keep in mind that we need to talk to Russia. Whatever causes or grievances or security concerns Russia had going into this war need to be understood, not justified, but understood. The Russian case must be heard in one way or another. But also we keep in mind that the response as a war is not a response. Of course, it's not justified, It's an unfair, unprovoked war. There is no question about it. But I think, again, in the long run, as we move forward into the post-war situation, post-Ukraine war situation, and we all will be thinking about this new security architecture, we have to keep in mind that if everybody burns bridges with Russia, who's going to talk to them at the end of the day? And of course, we are trying our best with that effort. Our president spoke to President Putin and Zelensky 2-3 times. He will be speaking to President Putin in the coming days again. And we all have to work hard to create an environment in which both sides feel safe, secure, and comfortable enough to come to the negotiating table.
Thank you so much. And once again, a degree of optimism coming out of the panel, perhaps surprisingly, regarding what you just talked about, which is moving away from isolationism as an approach. Moving now to China, Dr. Gong, where does China stand in the middle of all this?
Well, you probably have seen, various statements from the Chinese government. I would characterize it overall as sort of a neutrality stance. But I think, one very important issue is with respect to the sanctions organized by the United States and its allies. China obviously has announced that it has a no sanction policy so far. And actually it sides with a lot of countries. For example, all the BRICS countries, right? Brazil, India, for example. Entire ASEAN countries, barring Singapore. Almost all the South American countries, bulk of Africa, for example, bulk of Central Asia, these former Soviet republics. And bulk of the MENA region as well have all announced that, or have not announced that they have sanctions. So China is actually no different from these countries. But of course, China is under immense pressure from Washington because of its very unique role in terms of its, its role in world trade, its the role of its currency as a major settlement currency for trade, So that's a very unique issue here. And I would argue that China's non-sanction policy is more than motivated by the reasons that the previous guest has mentioned. Chinese government has said that there are various reasons and causes leading to this war, not all of which would be attributed to the Russian side. But I think in addition to this, I think the more important security reason is that China is very different from all the European countries in the sense that it shares a very long border with Russia, a border of 4,200 kilometers with Russia. China's plunging into sanctions would immediately insert itself into an animosity situation with Russia, with which China has its share of bitter historic memories. And Russia holds a stockpile of 3,000 nuclear heads, right? And you all know that. Almost all the countries so far have announced sanctions against Russia, enjoy, to some extent, one way or another, some nuclear power protection umbrella from Washington. China does not. And China, understandably, doesn't want to be dragged into a potential third world war that could be of epic proportions. China's nuclear capacity is only 1/10 of Russia's. So now Washington has issued recently some corrosive warnings about what's called implications and consequences if China, according to originally Sullivan's words, attempts to help Russia evade sanctions. But since a few days ago, the President Biden and President Xi's video call, the rhetoric has softened a little bit. It has softened to the implications and consequences of China providing material support to Russia. Okay, so what is the meaning of material support? I think this is the most important issue from China's perspective when it comes to sanctions. Okay, now my own interpretation currently refers to 3 points based on the United States State Department spokesperson Edward Price's words. Essentially, I would say that probably arms sales to Russia crosses the red line. It's definitely material support. using China's international payment system called CIPS to circumvent the SWIFT system, especially for dollar-denominated transactions, probably also qualifies as material support. And also, I would say dramatic increase in Sino-Russia trade is probably also material support. So what I mean by dramatic increase, I think we can use a but-for counterfactual approach to assess the Sino-US trade and ask this question. So had this war not happened, would this trade still have taken place, right? So last year, China-US trade increased by 36%. So the question is, does a 50% increase this year qualify as a material support? Well, I think it's probably on the borderline. I really don't think it's material support. Doubling, tripling of that trade amount probably is. That's just my personal view on this. Another related, very important issue about the Siberian 2 gas pipeline project, which is currently, I think it's getting into construction right now. Is that qualified as material support? I still don't think so, because even if this war didn't happen, this project would be going on anyway. So I think it's, here's a very important distinction here. United States basically is promoting a narrative that not imposing sanctions by China is the same as siding with the Russian side. This narrative doesn't apply to other countries, India, Brazil, other countries, but only to China. And I think this narrative should be rejected by the British experience during the entire 19th century, when London adopted what historians called a splendid isolation foreign policy with respect to the constant conflicts and wars on the European continent. That is, Great Britain didn't side with any state in Europe, nor any alliance on the European continent, but still maintained a normal trading relationship with each one of them. And this is basically a neutrality principle. And today, I call on countries like China and other countries that would like to stay out of this mess in Europe to adopt a policy of what I call principled neutrality, okay? And it should include at least the following 4 aspects. Principled neutrality strives for peace, which means restraint from actions that could directly contribute to military fighting in Ukraine, and obviously including sales of arms as well. Principled neutrality calls for proactive action to mediate truce and a peaceful political solution in Ukraine. I think Turkey is doing that, right? Principled neutrality also strives for the welfare of ordinary citizens in both Russia and Ukraine. And let me point out that historically, sanctions kill more people than war due to life hardship, starvation, denial of access to medical supplies, and etc. That means maintaining normal trade relationships with both Russia and Ukraine. Principled neutrality calls for humanitarian assistance to the people of Ukraine based on the United Nations humanitarian aid principles, i.e. humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. So in my view, the debate about China's stance in this war is not so much about whether being on the Russian side or on the Ukraine-US ally side. The international community needs to judge whether actions from Beijing are on the side of peace, on the side of humanity, and of course on the side of China's own national interests, which I don't think is fundamentally at odds with the global interests.
Dr. Gong, considering we have very little time left, I'm going to have to stop you there.
I was just about to stop.
Yeah, unfortunately, you did not quite tell us what this means for China in the region here in the Middle East, but I'm distilling from what you're saying is that it looks like it's going to be business as usual when it comes to the Chinese kind of role in the Middle East in light of all this. I don't detect a fundamental change, or am I wrong? Just very quickly.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me say that China maintains, actually, I think it's one of the few countries that maintains good relationship with all parties in the Middle East, among the major powers, including with Turkey, with Iran, with the Arab world, with Israel, actually, right? So, China is not so much interested in playing those geopolitical power games in this region. Because after all, China is a major trading partner. It's actually the largest trading nation in the world. It is actually the largest partner, trading partner of almost all the countries in the Middle East. So in general, China indeed genuinely seeks an environment of peace and stability in this region. And I think one trend, of course, that is sort of good coming out of this, if there's anything good coming out of this war, is that it looks like there's a lot of easing of relationships among some regional powers in this region, and this probably plays in the interest of from China's perspective. However, I will also say that oil price increases is very bad for China. I mean, you're seeing oil price shooting over $100 per barrel. China imports a lot of oil from this region. It imports a quarter of Saudi Arabia's exports of oil. So I think so from a political perspective, China seems to benefit a little bit from this horrendous war in Ukraine, but economically, it's actually suffering. It has an impact on trade, it's an impact on oil, and I'm afraid to say that also probably will have an impact on globalization. Globalization is up in the air right now.
Absolutely. Let me just turn back to Your Excellency Sheikh al-Islami. I am very curious about this time Russia's relationship with Iran and Iran's relationship with Russia in light of what's happening in Ukraine right now. For example, in Syria, both countries are quite involved in a very significant way, but perhaps could Russia's involvement in Ukraine pave the way for Iran to increase its scope of influence in places like Syria?
Thank you very much. I believe that Russia recently, in recent years, played a role of a balancer actor in the Middle East. Because of what happened in Ukraine, we expect that the involvement of Russia in the Middle East would be lesser. The Russians would be, busy with their business in Ukraine. So, of course, it doesn't mean that it will affect the role that Iran is playing in the region, including in Syria and the other countries of the region, because Iran has defined its relationship with Syria and with the other countries of the region in accordance with what they requested from us and what we can really do for stability and peace and security in the region. This is why I believe that the less involvement by Russia in the region, including in Syria, which is probable, cannot has any significant impact of Iranians' role in Syria and other countries of the region.
Okay, and Congresswoman Harman, I was going to turn to you. I know you seem to have a comment on this, so please go ahead.
Well, I think this is a very interesting conversation, and I agree with you that it is more hopeful than I expected. I wanted to say first how strongly I agree with the comments of our panelist from Turkey. I thought he made some important points about the need for a new geopolitics. And I endorse that personally, and I hope that my government endorses that too. And what that means is instead of how we all handled the end of the Cold War, I think you said it, I think we've all said it, which was, by my lights, I've just written a book about this called Insanity Defense, which explains the mistakes, including mine, over 30 years of my time in Congress and elsewhere. Instead of saying that the U.S. won, we're the sole superpower, China wants to be like us, and Russia lost, which obviously nurtured this sense of grievance that Vladimir Putin embodies. Now we have a chance to reset. First, we have to end the aggression in Ukraine. I think we've all agreed with that. But next, and not in 5 years, now, we have to talk together about the new geopolitics. And wouldn't it be wonderful if this region, since we are talking about the effect of this on the Middle East, could come together and these long simmering disputes among various countries for various reasons could be resolved, including Israel, including a new state of Palestine, and this region which has so much intellectual strength, so many natural resources, and so much beauty that could attract massive tourism, could become what it should have been years ago, which is a peaceful region where there is mutual nurture. And I think there's an opportunity now. I come from California, which is where all the earthquakes happen. There's an opportunity for the tectonic plates to adjust and for this to happen. And I listened carefully to everyone here. I'm done. And there was some hopefulness in every single comment. So let's give peace a chance.
Thank you so much. Can I probe you just on one point, which is very important? You raised it by invoking the other conflicts, which is some in the region here especially are saying the US is really exhibiting double standards by standing so vocally with Ukraine, and rightly so. However, critiquing that it did not quite do that in the context of other conflicts in the region, like in Syria and others.
Well, there is some truth to that, and not just in this region, but in Africa. There have been genocides. There is action. I know we don't have time for this, but some action that China is taking with regard to the Uyghurs, which the U.S. criticizes, but it is something we should perhaps focus more on. And we seem to be focused exclusively, for the moment, on Ukraine and Russia, a little bit on Iran, but we're not focused as much on other conflicts, which is why I think we're all saying the same thing. We need a strategy, not just tactics, a strategy around a new geopolitics that expresses democratic values. I think everybody here would say democratic values are good. We might define them differently. Human rights, opportunity, an effort to reduce income inequality, promote a cleaner climate. These are things that I don't think anyone in this room disagrees with. But there is now the opportunity to get this right. And we didn't get it right after the Cold War ended. Let's not want a new Cold War or a new hot war in the world. Let's want a better world.
Thank you. I mean, if there is such an opportunity, I want to go back to you, Dr. Al-Ansari. Qatar invested quite a lot in trying to support the opposition in Syria, for example, to try to remove the dictator Bashar al-Assad from power. And the United States had, at least rhetorically, said it is supportive of this. President Obama back in the day said Assad must go in 2011. And yet here we are today. And, going back to what Congresswoman Harman just said, which is, now perhaps is a moment for the US to do things differently. What can Qatar do to kind of push for this, perhaps new security architecture? If you think this is the way forward, you may disagree. But does Qatar agree? And if so, what can Qatar do so that all this investment that unfortunately did not lead to positive results can now kind of be redirected while we've learned the lessons of the not so distant past?
Well, I mean, let me just begin by saying this. Academics have been saying now for years that we are moving towards a multipolar world system, and that the new world of the post-Cold War period is reaching its end. But this is now being translated in geopolitics in the field. We are seeing this happening all across the world. And one symptom of that is the lack of trust in the great powers. And I think this lack of trust in great powers, whether it be the US or even the West in general as a concept, is not without its merits. As you said, we have seen during the Arab Spring, during the uprising and the revolution in Syria, we have seen a lack of support. We remember all the Obama red lines that were crossed every day without incident. And even for what happened, for example, in Crimea, what happened in South Ossetia, even before that in 2008, there is a general lack of trust that the powers that be today are able to enforce international law, able to enforce a UN charter, and therefore the whole world system that was based on that UN charter, on the concept that the peace and security in the world is a matter of rule of law. If we don't believe in it, if we don't trust it, then why would there be any security structure of any kind? And while I fully heartedly agree with what my friend Dr. Karen has said, I am very skeptical that our world today is ready to make itself into a new security order and to build a strategy that will provide us with peace. I know that you've been saying that this panel is quite hopeful, and let me contradict that a little bit by being a bit pessimistic, by saying that it doesn't look like anybody in the world today is ready to talk about a regional or an international security system or security structure that can help us talk to each other. There are disputes in this world that have had all the possible chances to discuss peaceful resolutions on and to initiate dialogue, and dialogue was never even attempted. And sadly, a lot of the great powers that are now theorizing what should happen in Ukraine have stayed silent in crises that surpass the crisis in Ukraine in numbers of human lives and in the atrocities that we have seen. And this has left a sore feeling in the bodies of people in this part of the world, in the global south in general. If the West is to expect the rest of the world to respect the moral superiority that is perceived, and to respect the international world order, and to listen when the West is pointing its finger at somebody, then the West, the US, and their allies really need to talk very frankly and very openly with the rest of the world. We are moving to a multipolar world. Let's talk together on how to get there. Because if we don't, what is going to happen is that we will see a world where everybody is trying to be part of this new world order without feeling as being part of an international security system that is needed.
Thank you so much. I believe we are out of time, according to my watch at least. I want to say this has been a very rich and frank discussion, and perhaps we've moved from, the realism, the pragmatism that you've just invoked, to perhaps what also could be, the possibilities where the international stakeholders in all these conflicts to actually embrace doing the right thing. So I want to thank you all for your wonderful contributions, and thank the audience for being with us today. And this is a conversation to be continued for sure. Thank you so much.